Hey everybody, it's me, Derek DC Phillips, bringing you all things frightful. And today I wanted to talk about a few things that I feel the true crime genre in general gets wrong from time to time. So this video is purely full of my own opinion and conjecture.
That's my opinion!
And I won't be calling out any specific content creators or that sort of thing, any YouTube channels that I've stumbled across. It's actually bigger than that. And a few of these concerns I've also noticed in my own work, and I try to be more and more conscious of. So the purpose of this video today is pretty much to indulge my ramblings, but also to encourage conversation. I'm curious to know what you think in the comments after the fact. So without further ado, let's jump into 3 things I feel true crime gets wrong. Number 1, failure to humanize the victim or victims. This is a big one for me, and it's one that I didn't necessarily get until I saw some really horrendous examples of victims kind of just being glossed over. So to explain a bit more of where I'm coming from with this, you know, on Saturday Night Live, how Bill Hader, I believe it was Bill Hader, would do the sketches kind of mocking 2020 segments or Dateline segments. He would talk with a witness, a police officer, that sort of thing. And as the details became more and more gruesome, he would make this like weird, creepy face and make some weird noises like, oh.
Oh, that's terrible.
Then ultimately, when he found out that someone survived, someone escaped from a serial killer, he would say, oh. And there was obvious disappointment there. That's kind of what I'm getting at with this. I've noticed that in some true crime, I'll say shows, podcasts, documentaries, it doesn't really matter. There are quite a few where victims are just sort of incidental. They're sort of objectified. So they're either there for gore factor or that salacious factor that, oh wow, something, they were really into something awful, or they're just a number, right? They're a statistic. They're one of the victims, and we don't really find out very much. I find that some of the most compelling true crime content actually delves into the lives of the victims. There's an emotional connection there. And I think then we really start to focus more on the ripple effect that one serial killer's actions have on a community, on a town, on families. And it becomes so much more psychological. That's one thing that's kind of a pet peeve for me that I pick up on from time to time. Number 2 is actually related to number 1, but to me it's a little bit different. Number 2 for me is overly sensationalizing or being overly melodramatic. Often there is scary music overlaid to the narrative, and that, you know, that's fine to an extent. Mood music in, I'll say, entertainment, in media is a staple, and it does add to, you know, it's another creative element that is part of any production. However, there are just certain instances, and I can't really pinpoint one, that rub me the wrong way. It's almost like also when there's like an excess of blood spatter on the art that goes with it. I think overuse of humor is another way that victims are sometimes objectified. I totally understand there are some weird true crime cases, and there is an element of morbid humor that can definitely be brought in, and I appreciate that. You know, I'm guilty of it. So I get it, but there's a fine line that you almost can't pinpoint. But when it's crossed, it leaves you feeling kind of cringy. When I find that that line has been crossed between telling a story, relating the facts, and being overly sensational, I can't help but feel a little bit icky. Because it's one thing to be intrigued, it's one thing to wonder what if. It's one thing to try to be an armchair detective. There are so many reasons that we consume true crime content. And yes, there is an entertainment element there. But I think there is a difference between that sort of documentary feel and sheer entertainment. And I'll give an example. I said I wasn't going to call out specifics, but I will say, growing up, I really enjoyed the investigation discovery specials and things like that. They still have some really good ones, but started to realize, you know, the titles started to get more and more outrageous. It would be like, it would start out with something as nondescript as killer women. Okay, that makes sense. There's a real subgenre there. There's a real theme to explore there, I suppose. But then you get into, I don't know, I think there was swamp murders, there were nightmare neighbors, and you can tell just by the titles that get more and more out of control that it's like, okay, we're getting further away from a title that matches the topic to a T and into more salacious territory. And that rubs me the wrong way sometimes. If you have watched any of my true crime videos, you may be thinking, wait a minute, you hypocrite. I saw blood spatter on the thumbnail image of that video. I get it, and it's something that I kind of question myself as I'm creating a thumbnail, for example, for a video. I will say again, this is something that I am kind of navigating as well, and I'm curious to know what other people think because it's not so cut and dry. I will also say, and I have mentioned this in a video or two, if I cover a true crime case, I'm trying to cover cases that are older. And when I say older, I mean significantly older. Um, you know, 20 years is kind of pushing it, but a couple of the cases I've covered are 100 plus years old. That makes me feel a little more comfortable because, again, there's no one in the family left when a case is over 100 years old who would be likely to be offended by what I'm saying, or, again, bringing in that dark humor from earlier. If there are any of those elements, no one's going to feel hurt by that. My final true crime pet peeve is interviewing complete thirst buckets. You heard that correctly.
The thirst is real. The thirst is real.
This is at the very top of my list. It's something that I do find a lot of those more salacious shows are guilty of. I know I said I wasn't going to give an example, but I'm going to give another specific example. Recently, I caught up on, I believe it was called Village of the Damned. It's now on Discovery Plus. And the first episode or so was very intriguing. I thought they did a really great job. The reenactments were very tasteful that they included. But actually, I think the Village of the Damned kind of ties all of this together. Because as you go along, you start to realize, spoiler alert, that there's no real curse here. All of the terrible events that happen, and I will say they were all terrible. All of the terrible events happened to this town, or in this town, over a 10 plus year period, like 10 to 15 years if I'm not mistaken. None of the cases were related. There may have been a murder here, a suicide there. There was no correlation, no connection. Even the events happened in kind of suburbs. Like, you could tell they definitely took cases that were somewhere close to one another and tried to mash them together to insinuate that this town was cursed. And it just didn't fit. While independently, I thought that the cases that they introduced probably warranted, an episode of a true crime show. It just rubbed me the wrong way that they were trying to bill this town as being cursed. And I wasn't alone, apparently, because when I started doing a bit more research, actually family members and residents were not happy. They thought it was very distasteful that their loved ones' deaths were being sort of molded to fit this narrative that just didn't exist by any stretch of the imagination. On top of that, circling back to the thirst buckets, there were people interviewed. I do distinctly remember one server who worked in a diner for years and years, no connection to a single one of the victims. But her approach was so melodramatic. I'm sure she was asked questions that coached her into a specific direction, but her responses were all so dramatic. You know, this is no quote, but something along the lines of, "How can a town recover once the devil has visited?" And it's like, seriously, you personally were not affected by any of this, and we don't even know when you moved into town. That was glossed over. So it's very clear in many true crime specials, documentaries, again, where perhaps actual witnesses, people who were actually affected by the events, were either unwilling to talk or just I don't know, maybe there was no effort put in to find them. But you can very much tell when someone says, "Oh yeah, she was my best friend in kindergarten, but then she moved away. I can't believe she died 2 years ago as a full grown adult." You know what I mean? It's just icky a little bit. Anyway, I've ranted enough. I know I've said on this channel before I don't like to focus on the negative, and I'm not trying to do that here. I'm not trying to bash anybody's work per se. But again, I just wanted to sort of put some thoughts out there for things that tend to rub me the wrong way when I am listening to a podcast or watching a documentary or a docuseries that involves true crime. And I'm curious to know if others feel the same way. There is such a fine line between topics of psychological interests and even abnormal psychology and full-blown entertainment. You know what I mean? It feels odd when I go into a documentary and I get what I would maybe expect more from a slasher movie. And I do love slasher movies, but I just don't know how I feel about a true crime case getting that kind of treatment. Does that make sense? Let me know if you agree, if you disagree, or if you'd like to add anything down in the comments. Thanks.